Brilliant. Yeah, thanks a lot to the organizers for putting this paper on the program. It's a work in progress together with my colleague Ray Chang. We're based both at Aarhus University in Denmark. And in this paper, we quantify the role of diverse modes of migration and the associated remittances in distributing the benefits of international trade across space. Now, to motivate why this is important, I'm going to show you this map of China. And China entered the WTO in the early 2000s. And what you can see is that basically exactly the regions that have been exposed to trade have also been experienced an increase in employment share. So there's been an important distribution implications of trade, meaning that regional inequality has increased over time. And this has been documented in the literature, and there are different papers that have studied that already. Now, we also know that urbanization accounts for about 80% of China's urban growth. And that is despite the fact that there are huge mobility frictions at hand, and that goes through the so-called hukou system. Now, the hukou system is a household registration system which was implemented in the 1950s in order to control the amount of urbanization in China. Now, that basically meant that a household moving from rural to urban would not be able to purchase housing, potentially education, etc., public services. And you were assigned your hukou depending on where you were born or where your parents are from. So that meant all your social benefits, for example, and public services are tied to your hukou status. Now, that means that there's a huge proportion of population that may live in urban, however, their status is a rural hukou. That implies they're not enjoying the benefits of public services from urban, but they have to, in a sense, pay more for public services in these regions. Now, this is where Ray and I, we sat together and we were like, well, hang on, basically this floating population, they're deciding to separate their households across space. But that also implies that they're potentially separating the household and they have to remit a substantial amount of income to support the family back home. Social scientists have basically studied this already a lot, and issues such as the left behind generation, where children and the elderly are being left behind, and the working population is living in the urban areas, these are a huge amount of issues. However, within the trade labor literature, nobody has really tied these bits together. So what we use is basically 3 sets of data. It's Chinese customs data for trade flows. It's the CHIPS data, which is a Chinese household survey in order to understand migration patterns and who moves to urban areas. And the third data is the Chinese census data. Now, what we highlighted is exactly that point. Well, households have different choices to take. You either move your entire household to the urban area, which we call complete migration, or you move partially to the urban area, which we call partial migration. That also means that if you're partially migrating, there will be a huge amount of remittances being sent back home. And just give you an order of magnitude, in absolute terms, the domestic remittances within China are larger than the remittances that India receives from individuals living abroad. Now, what you can see is basically the density of remittance shares of income by different migration types. We have the complete migrants in 2002 and 2007, and we have the partial migrants. And what you can see is that basically, on average, partial migrants, as we would expect, remit a greater proportion of their income back home. And what we can also see is that basically this distribution is more skewed. So that means if they remit, they may even remit a bigger proportion than complete migrants. We also show that basically 30% of migrants are partial migrants. And the way we define remittances is basically it has to be interregional, so from urban to rural, and it's within the household. And then there's an extensive margin that we analyze and an intensive margin of these remittances. So to give you a brief summary of what our contribution is, so we provide 3 novel pieces of evidences that tie together trade, migration, and remittances. And the first piece of evidence is going to be that we show that trade induces rural to urban migration, and that as a proportion of migration, partial migrants are very important. The second piece of evidence is regarding the remittances, and that partial migrants submit a larger proportion of the income back home than complete migrations, which may also have still ties back home. And then we show the other side of the coin. So basically rural households that send out migrants, they have a larger proportion of income than, or they have a higher income on average than households that send no migrants. And then we provide, in order to account for these different patterns that we observe in the data, we provide a quantitative model, which is a spatial general equilibrium model of migration and trade, where we include remittances and heterogeneous modes of migration. So importantly, households have the decision, if they move, they need to decide what mode of migration to take. So either partial or complete. And they also have the decision what proportion of their income to send back home. And we use a non-homothetic preference theory, which basically implies the higher your income is, you may send less of your income back home because you also enjoy some income in the urban areas. And in order to quantify and to test whether this remittance channel is important in redistributing income across regions, we calibrate and simulate our model to simulate the Chinese trade shock. And then we give some implications for trade and migration policy and how they may interact or substitute one another. And the mechanism basically in our theory goes in 2 ways. So when trade liberalization happens, you have an increase in export and import opportunities across urban areas. And there's a wage channel, which is kind of more the exporting side of the trade shock. And then you have the price channel. So these are benefits potentially by importing cheaper goods. And so the wage channel goes as follows, that a lower trade cost increases export-related production in urban, and that is going to increase labor demand. And increased labor demand increases wages, and that is going to induce more migration. The price channel, on the other hand, means that the price index in the urban areas reduces relatively more compared to rural. And so basically, because it's cheaper now to live in urban areas, that's going to induce more complete migration. So instead of splitting your household, you want to benefit from this price, cheaper price index, and you're going to move potentially your entire household. So we calibrate and simulate our initial equilibrium of a simplified model. Basically, we have 3 regions, urban, rural, and the rest of the world. We're going to simplify it and only have 1 sector as well. And we're going to remove the non-homothetic preferences as well. And with this very simple model, we show that basically migration-induced increase in remittances is important in distributing the benefits of trade across regions. And this is quantitatively important, and we also show that this is crucially, or obviously depends also on the amount of mobility frictions at hand. And here what you can see is that basically we just plot the urban, rural, and the wage gap basically, and the total remittances. And if we were to exclude the remittance channel, we would basically conclude that trade increases inequality across regions. However, if you take into consideration that remittances also increase as migration increases, then basically actually this could counteract the initial increase of inequality. Okay, so as a summary, we established 3 novel facts, and then we tie these facts regarding remittances, migration, and trade together in a quantitative framework. And we show that basically within this framework, this remittance channel is important in distributing the benefits of trade across space. And what we're going to do next is basically quantify the more general theory, and we're going to also analyze in more detail the migration versus trade policies implications, whether they complement or substitute each other. Brilliant. So that's it from my side, and I'm happy to receive questions.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was great. If anyone does have any questions, please raise the little yellow hand.
Yeah, I had a question. I don't know how to raise my yellow hand yet.
The clap for now.
So you mentioned that trade reduces the price of traded goods in the urban areas to which the migrants move. I wonder whether there's an offsetting price effect from congestion and whether non-traded goods become more expensive in these urban areas, so that when you deflate the higher wages by the different price indices, there's a large offsetting effect from higher price levels in general in urban areas.
Yeah, that's right. And that's going to be in particular important if we calibrate the more general framework where we're going to have different industries as well. And then, yeah, you're right, that could easily happen. In our more simplified model, we kind of shut down these implications. But you are right that there could be potentially, if you have several industries and some will be more exposed to trade than others, then that could easily happen.
I mean, having visited Shanghai myself, at least what tourists consume is very expensive there.
Yes, that's right.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Yes, Matthias.
Hi, I just have a short clarifying question. You said at some point that with non-homothetic preferences, remittances go down. Is that right? So the non-homotheticity is such that when I get richer, I want to share less of my income, or is it the other way around?
So basically, the non-homotheticity implies that as your income increases, you're not going to spend it on substantial need goods, but you're going to spend it more on luxury goods. Now, if you live or you're earning your income in urban, that may imply that you're going to cover the substantial need at home, but the extra income is going to be spent potentially on luxury goods. So that can imply that either if it's a fixed share of your income that you're remitting, it can still mean that remittances increase in absolute terms.
So
but in terms of as
a
a share of income, it may remain fixed.
Okay. So basically the idea is that remittances are only there to cover the food subsistence level.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay. That is, I'm not sure that's I don't know, realistic. I don't know if that's the right, because it seems to me that if I was a really successful migrant, I would try to basically give my family back home more than just subsistence, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
I mean,
I
see the point. Yeah. No.
So in the survey, they actually asked people, what do you use or why do you send remittances back home? And the main reason is always to support family back home for education, for food, etc. So there are explicit questions that actually cover, and it gives us an idea that it is subsistence need. But you are right, and I mean, basically, we can also see that our theory even implies that remittances, because of the extensive margin of migration increasing, remittances in total obviously increase, but actually not so much the intensive margin. So it does seem that basically the share of remittances as a share of income seem to be relatively fixed over time.
Okay.
Yeah. Good comment, thanks.
But that's including now intensive and extensive margin.
Yes.
Somebody else is asking a question. I can just keep bugging you about.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because
yeah.
then you would think that if you think that people get richer on average over time and remittances as a share of income do not change, then that would be an implication that it's homothetic.
So keep in mind for this calibration, that for this quantitative exercise, we shut down the non-homothetic preferences, right? Okay. And we find that. Now the thing is, just looking at the data, it seems that it's like on average, it hasn't changed, the numbers haven't changed. Now, obviously, when we include the non-hemostatic preferences in our theory, we'll be able to see what a trade shock would actually do to the remittance.
It hasn't changed. I'm just trying to understand whether non-hemostatic preferences for this type of, share of income that you send home, if non-hemostatic preferences is the correct way of doing this, right? Because per capita, it would be nice to look at that in the data, I think. Just to be more careful in looking at the data, like what is really the share of income that goes into remittances as a function of an individual, people's household or earnings in the city. I think that would be interesting. I think that's generally very interesting.
Yeah, and then in general,
I really like the paper, so just to be clear.
No, I think it's a genuinely very good point. And in the beginning, we were agnostic about it. We weren't sure about it, but it seems just looking at the averages across these cross sections that as a share of income, remittances have not increased. Now, obviously, allowing in the theory a more richer version and calibrating that, we'll see what will actually happen to the remittances. There's exactly one of these interesting puzzle pieces that we haven't resolved yet. But as of now, in this quantitative exercise, we have shut down non-homostatic preferences. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I think the breakout room will be closing in the next couple of minutes. If anyone's got any questions or comments between now and then, please do feel free to jump in. Otherwise, we'll be heading back to the main room soon for the STEG program update in about.
Just wanted to say it was very interesting. Thanks
Thanks a lot.
Looking forward to the paper once you have it.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and if anyone else has comments or questions, feel free to send me an email. We'll be more than happy to receive that.
Thank you.
Thanks as well.